The last picture on the wall in Edward's office showed a smiling woman with red hair holding her pregnant belly. That photo, taken just 3 weeks before the tragedy, was like a frozen window into a future that never happened. Sitting in his leather executive chair, he gazed at the image as the numbers on his computer screen blurred before his tired eyes. The mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, was a silent testament to his fortune, and, simultaneously, his loss. Built with Catherine in mind, every detail meticulously planned to be the perfect home for her family, it now served only as a constant reminder of shattered dreams. The answering machine blinked with a message from Lily's private school. "Mr. Harrison, we need to discuss Lily's progress. She continues to isolate herself during recess and refuses to participate in group activities. We would like to schedule a meeting." Edward hung up the message with a heavy sigh. Her daughter, born the same night Catherine left, bore not only congenital blindness, but also the involuntary weight of maternal absence, and he, in his inability to deal with the pain, had become more of a ghost in the girl's life than a present father. The decision to hire Charlotte Reynolds was not yours. The housekeeper, Mrs. Miller, after 15 years of service, insisted that they needed someone who specialized in special education. "The girl needs more than just basic care, sir. She needs someone who understands her world." Charlotte arrived on a rainy Monday, with an impressive resume and an energy that contrasted with the gloomy atmosphere of the mansion. At 32 years old, he had experience with visually impaired children and an innovative approach that combined traditional teaching with modern sensory development techniques. "I'm not looking for a therapist," Edward had said during the interview, his tone distant and professional. "Just someone to help with daily care." "With all due respect, Mr. Harrison," Charlotte replied, her green eyes holding his gaze with calm determination. "Every interaction with a child is an opportunity for learning and growth. We cannot simply ignore that." This response should have irritated him. He was used to having the last word in every situation. But something in Charlotte's quiet conviction made him reconsider. Now, 2 weeks later, Edward watched from behind the curtains of his office as Charlotte and Lily sat in the garden. The new employee had created a learning system that transformed reading Braille into a kind of sensory game. Small objects related to the story were placed around Lily, allowing her to build tactile connections with the narrative. "So, what do you think the bunny found in the forest?" Charlotte's melodious voice floated to the window. Lily, normally so restrained, reached out to touch a small plush piece. It's soft, like the rabbit's ears in the story." Her laugh, a sound Edward barely recognized, echoed through the garden. The sound hit Edward like a physical wave, making his chest tighten. "When was the last time you heard your daughter laugh like that? Had you already heard?" The past 7 years were a haze of corporate meetings, business trips, and quick interactions mediated by nannies and tutors. Charlotte leaned over to adjust the Braille book on Lily's lap, her brown hair falling like a curtain over her intent face. Gently, he guided the girl's small fingers over the raised dots. "Very well. Now, shall we try to read this part together?" Edward watched as his daughter instinctively moved closer to Charlotte, her shoulders relaxed in a way they never were in his presence. The scene stirred in him a confusing mix of emotions: gratitude, jealousy, regret, and something else, something he wasn't ready to name. His phone buzzed with a message from the office. Yet another crisis needed his immediate attention. But for the first time in years, Edward hesitated before answering. His eyes remained fixed on the scene in the garden, where his daughter was discovering a new world through the gentle hands of a stranger who, in just 2 weeks, had managed to penetrate the walls he himself had built. The afternoon wore on, painting the Connecticut sky with shades of orange and pink, as Edward remained motionless at his observation post. Charlotte was now singing a soft song, her hands dancing in the air to create patterns that Lily could feel as she touched the teacher's arms. It was a delicate dance between light and shadow, sound and silence, past and present. Edward realized that something was changing inside him, like ice melting after a long winter. Charlotte's presence wasn't just transforming Lily, He was, involuntarily, beginning to melt the layers of protection he had built around his own heart. When he finally turned away from the window, Edward carried with him a disturbing certainty. His carefully controlled life was about to change in ways he could not predict. And for the first time since losing Catherine, the prospect of change didn't completely terrify him. The next morning, Edward found himself in front of the mirror adjusting his tie with fidgety fingers. The garden scene from the previous day continued to reverberate in his mind, like a song that refuses to be forgotten. His eyes fell on the photo of Catherine on his bedside table. She seemed to smile differently today, almost as if she knew something he hadn't yet realized. Breakfast at the Harrison mansion has always followed a meticulously timed routine. Edward usually had his coffee alone in the office at 6:30 before Lily woke up. But today, something compelled him to change. Checking his Patek Philippe watch, he noticed he still had 40 minutes before his first video conference. Upon entering the kitchen, he found a scene that caught him off guard. Charlotte was standing next to the stove, guiding Lily's hands as the girl held a spatula. The aroma of pancakes filled the room. "Now you will feel when the dough starts to make bubbles at the edges," explained Charlotte patiently. "That's how we know it's time to turn." "But what if I make a mistake?" Lily's voice trembled slightly. "Then we'll have a funny pancake." Charlotte laughed softly. "Some of the best discoveries happen by accident, you know." Edward cleared his throat, announcing his presence. The fright made Lily drop the spatula, which clanked against the marble floor. "Mr. Harrison!" Charlotte recovered quickly, keeping a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder. "We weren't expecting it. I mean, your coffee is served in the office as usual." "Dad?" Lily turned her face towards the sound, her small hands clutching the apron she was wearing. "I thought I'd have coffee here today," he replied, his voice sounding strangely formal, even to his own ears. An uncomfortable silence fell over the kitchen. Charlotte was the first to break it, moving naturally to pick up a clean cup. "Lily was learning how to make pancakes. It's part of our sensory development project, working with textures, temperatures, and timing." Edward watched as his daughter remained tense, as if expecting a reprimand. How many times had his presence caused this reaction? The realization hit him like a punch in the gut. Can I try one?" he asked, trying to soften his voice. Lily's face brightened momentarily before being replaced by an expression of uncertainty. "They don't look very pretty yet." "The best things aren't always the prettiest," Charlotte interjected gently, casting a meaningful look at Edward. Sitting at the kitchen table, a space he barely recognized despite being in his own home, Edward watched Charlotte and Lily resume their activity. The teacher had a unique way of transforming every moment into a learning opportunity, but without losing the lightness of the moment. "See? Can you hear the different hiss?" Charlotte guided Lily's senses. "That means it's almost ready." Edward realized he was witnessing a kind of language he never knew how to speak, a communication that went beyond words, built on small gestures and mutual trust. When a pancake was finally placed in front of him, he noticed that it had an irregular shape, looking more like a cloud than a perfect circle. Lily waited anxiously, her fingers drumming nervously on the table. "It's delicious," he said after the first mouthful, surprised that he wasn't lying. There was something special about that imperfect pancake, made by small, inexperienced hands. Charlotte smiled, a smile that seemed to light up the entire kitchen. "See, Lily? Sometimes we just need to give things a chance." The comment carried a weight that didn't go unnoticed by Edward. His phone vibrated in his pocket, probably his assistant reminding him about the video conference. But for the first time in years, he ignored it. "Could you teach me how to make another one?" Lily asked shyly, turning her face in the direction where she knew her father was. Edward felt his throat tighten. "I have a meeting in 20 minutes. "Oh." The disappointment in Lily's voice was palpable, even in a single syllable. "But maybe," he found himself saying before he could stop himself, "maybe tomorrow." The smile that appeared on her daughter's face was like a ray of sunshine after a long storm. Charlotte, discreetly busy with the dishes, couldn't hide her own smile. As he walked up the stairs to his office minutes later, Edward realized that something fundamental had changed that simple morning in the kitchen. It was as if a door he had locked himself was slowly opening, letting in a light he hadn't seen in a long time. His virtual meeting with investors in Shanghai seemed strangely distant now, as if it belonged to another life. In his mind, the sound of Lily's laughter mixed with the scent of pancakes and Charlotte's serene presence, creating a melody he didn't know he was hungry to hear. A stack of documents was waiting for Edward's signature on his desk when Mrs. Miller knocked on the office door with a worried expression. "Sir, there is something you need to see." Following the housekeeper to the second-floor hallway, Edward heard voices coming from Lily's room, a room he rarely visited. The door was ajar, allowing the scene to gradually reveal itself. Charlotte was sitting on the floor with Lily, surrounded by dozens of scattered photos. With a start, Edward recognized the images. They were Catherine's albums that he had stored in the attic years ago, unable to deal with the memories they contained. "This was taken on your parents' wedding day," Charlotte was explaining, guiding Lily's fingers over a photograph. "Your mother wore a vintage lace dress, and your father couldn't take his eyes off her." "What did she look like?" Lily asked, her fingers delicately tracing the contours of the photo. Edward felt his heart quicken, ready to stop this moment that felt like a painful invasion of his past. But before he could intervene, Charlotte's response stopped him in his tracks. "She had hair like copper wire in the sun," Charlotte described, her soft voice painting images that Lily could see. "And when he smiled, little dimples formed just like yours." The girl instinctively touched her own face, as if searching for that tangible connection with the mother she never knew. Edward watched, torn between familiar pain and something new, a dawning realization that perhaps he had denied his daughter not only his presence, but also the memory of Catherine. "Mr. Harrison?" Charlotte noticed his presence, standing up quickly. "I found the albums while cleaning out the attic. I thought Lily might know." "Continue." The words escaped his mouth before he could stop them. His voice sounded hoarse, filled with long-suppressed emotions. "Please." Lily turned her head in the direction of his voice, her fingers still gripping the photograph. "Dad, are you staying?" Edward entered the room as if stepping into foreign territory. The space, which Charlotte had clearly reorganized, was full of tactile elements, embossed maps on the walls, mobiles that made soft sounds in the breeze, shelves of braille books. He sat down hesitantly on the floor, forming a triangle with Charlotte and Lily. Mrs. Miller discreetly closed the door, leaving them in their bubble of shared memories. "This was taken on our first date," Edward found himself saying, pulling out a photo of him and Catherine laughing in a cafe. "She spilled coffee on my new shirt, and instead of being embarrassed, said she was just marking her territory." Lily's laugh echoed through the room, a sound that still caught him off guard every time he heard it. Charlotte smiled, her eyes meeting Edward's with a mixture of approval and something deeper that he wasn't ready to decipher. Over the next hour, the stories flowed, some told by Edward, others by Charlotte, who seemed to have a natural gift for transforming still images into vivid narratives that Lily could understand through other senses. "Your mother loved gardening," Edward shared, holding a photo of Catherine in her rose garden. "She said each flower had its own personality." "Like the roses in the garden now?" Lily asked excitedly. "Charlotte lets me touch the petals and smell the different scents." Edward looked surprised at Charlotte, who blushed slightly. "I thought it would be a good way to maintain the connection. The roses are still the same ones your wife planted." Realization hit him like a gentle wave. While he had hidden himself from all memories of Catherine, Charlotte was silently helping Lily build a bridge to the past, a bond with the mother she never knew. The afternoon sun was beginning to wane when Mrs. Miller returned to remember that dinner would be served soon. Edward realized he'd missed 3 important calls and a virtual meeting, and surprisingly, He didn't care. "Can we do this again?" Lily asked, her voice filled with hope. Edward looked at Charlotte, who maintained a calm expression, as if she perfectly understood the weight of that moment. "Yes," he replied, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "We can." As he helped put away the photos, his fingers accidentally brushed Charlotte's as they reached for the same image. The contact, brief and involuntary, sent an electric current through his arm that made him quickly withdraw his hand. Later, in his office, Edward gazed at the photo of Catherine that he had always kept on his desk. For the first time in 7 years, he didn't just feel pain when he looked at her. There was something more, a growing realization that perhaps honoring his memory didn't mean living eternally in the shadows of his loss. The sound of distant laughter came through the open window. Lily and Charlotte in the garden again, probably exploring the roses that Catherine had loved so much. Edward closed his eyes, letting the sound fill the empty spaces in his heart, spaces that were slowly beginning to awaken to the possibility of something new. Monday started with an unexpected call from Lily's school. The headmistress, Mrs. Henderson, requested an urgent meeting with Edward to discuss her daughter's surprising progress over the past few weeks. Sitting in his Audi in the mansion's garage, he reread the message several times, his mind going back to the scene of the shared breakfast days ago. Charlotte should attend the meeting, Mrs. Miller suggested over coffee, her voice carrying that familiar blend of efficiency and maternal authority she had developed over the years. After all, she is largely responsible for the changes in Lily. Edward nodded, surprising himself with the speed of his agreement. Charlotte's presence had become an undeniable fact in his life, like an undercurrent imperceptibly altering the ground beneath his feet. At school, the hallways decorated with children's work seemed strangely intimidating. Charlotte walked beside him, her navy blazer and pencil skirt conveying a professionalism that contrasted with her usual informality at home. Edward realized it was the first time he had seen her dressed like this, and something about this observation disturbed him in a way he chose not to examine. "Mr. Harrison, Ms. Reynolds, please come in." Mrs. Henderson greeted them with a warm smile. "We have excellent news about Lily." The meeting revealed transformations that Edward had barely noticed. Lily was participating more in group activities, had made her first friend, a girl named Grace, and was showing a growing interest in music, especially after Charlotte introduced a learning method that combined musical notes with different textures. "It's like she's finally opening up to the world," the director explained, her eyes shining with excitement. "And I must say, Mr. Harrison, that your more frequent presence at breakfasts has also made a noticeable difference." Edward felt his ears burn, aware of Charlotte's soft gaze on him. How did the director know about the breakfasts? Lily should have mentioned it. "Actually," Charlotte interjected, her voice soft but firm, "Lily has a project she'd like to perform at next week's recital. She's been practicing a lot at home." "A recital?" Edward sat up straighter, immediate tension coursing through his shoulders. Public events had always made him uncomfortable since Catherine's death. "She's going to play the piano," Charlotte explained, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of gentleness and determination. "A piece she chose especially for you." The way back home was filled with silence, filled with unspoken words. Edward drove, his fingers drumming restlessly on the steering wheel. While Charlotte looked out the window, the profile of her face softened by the late afternoon light. "You should have consulted me about the recital," he finally said, his voice harsher than he intended. Charlotte turned to him, no fear or hesitation in her gaze. "Lily asked me not to tell you. She wanted to surprise you. She's been practicing for weeks, always when you're at work." The mention of the hours he spent away from home hit Edward like a silent accusation. "I don't know if I'm ready to—" "It's not about you being ready," Charlotte interrupted him gently. "It's about Lily being ready. She's reaching important milestones, Edward. She can't keep missing these moments." It was the first time she had called him by his first name, and something about the intimacy of that gesture made his heart skip a beat. Stopping at a red light, he allowed himself to really look at her, her brown hair tied up in a messy bun, a few strands escaping to frame her face, her green eyes that seemed to see through all of her carefully constructed defenses. Catherine loved music, he admitted, the words escaping before he could stop them. She played the violin. I know, Charlotte replied softly. Lily found the violin in the attic. She spends hours plucking the strings, trying to imagine what it sounded like when her mother played. The image of his daughter alone in the attic, seeking connections with a mother she had never met, made something inside him shatter. A lone tear escaped, and before he could wipe it away, he felt Charlotte's fingers gently touch his arm. You are not betraying Catherine's memory by allowing Lily to live fully, she said, her voice little more than a whisper. In fact, perhaps this is the best way to honor her. The light changed, but Edward remained still for a moment, letting Charlotte's words sink into his heart. When he finally returned to driving, something had subtly changed between them. A mutual understanding that went beyond employer and employee, beyond two people caring for the same child. When they arrived home, they found Lily at the piano in the music room, her small fingers gliding over the keys with intense concentration. The melody, although simple, carried an emotion that made Edward stop in the doorway, unable to move. Dad? Lily asked, noticing his presence. You're early today. Yes, I wanted to hear you play. The smile that lit up her daughter's face was like a ray of sunshine breaking through clouds after a long storm. Charlotte walked past him, lightly brushing his arm as she entered the room, and Edward realized that he was, slowly but inexorably, learning to live again. The recital approached like a storm cloud on the horizon, bringing with it a mixture of anxiety and expectation that permeated every corner of the mansion. Edward observed the subtle changes in the household's routine, the extra hours of practice on the piano, the excited whispers between Charlotte and Lily, and the growing pile of sheet music adapted in Braille on the piano. During a particularly busy afternoon at the office, his phone buzzed with a message from Charlotte. It was an audio recording of Lily practicing her play. Edward closed the door, sat down in his leather chair and pressed play. The notes flowed through the speakers, imperfect but charged with emotion. His eyes closed involuntarily, and for a moment, he could swear he felt Catherine's presence at his side. It's Claire de Lune, Charlotte's voice came from the hallway when he returned home earlier that day. Lily chose it after I explained that the song is about moonlight, something that, like her, no one can see, but everyone can feel. Edward stood at the entrance to the music room, watching as Charlotte gently guided her daughter's hands over the keys. There was an intimacy to the scene that made her heart squeeze in a way she couldn't identify. Was it pain or something more? Dad! Lily exclaimed, her fingers freezing on the keys. You're early! I thought I'd listen to you practice, he replied, his voice huskier than usual. If you don't mind. Charlotte stood up from the piano bench, a soft smile on her lips. I'll make us some tea. No, Edward found himself saying. Stay. Please. Something passed over Charlotte's face. Surprise, perhaps gratitude. Before she sat down again, this time in the armchair next to the piano. Edward occupied the couch, feeling strangely nervous in his own environment. Lily began to play, her small hands moving with a determination that Edward had never noticed before. When she missed a note, Charlotte murmured words of encouragement, and the girl continued, more confident. Catherine used to play this song, Edward heard himself saying, the words escaping before he could stop them. On the violin. Lily stopped playing, her face turning towards her father's voice. Really? How did she play? Edward closed his eyes, letting the memories flow. Like I was talking to the moon. Every note was magical. Charlotte watched the interaction with bright eyes, her hands clasped in her lap. Perhaps, she suggested softly, you could show Lily your mother's violin. The weight of the instrument that remained untouched in the attic seemed to press against his chest. I don't know if... Please, Dad. Lily's voice was barely above a whisper. I wanted so badly to be able to play something she played. Edward met Charlotte's eyes, searching for… what? Permission? Courage? She nodded slightly, as if she understood exactly what he needed at that moment. The journey to the attic was like a pilgrimage. Charlotte and Lily followed him in respectful silence. The violin case was exactly where he had left it 7 years ago, covered in a fine layer of dust. With shaking hands, Edward opened the case. The instrument still shined, preserved by the velvet that wrapped it. Lily reached out her hands tentatively, and he guided her fingers along the smooth outline of the wood. It's so beautiful, she whispered, her fingers exploring every curve. I can feel where she was holding it. Charlotte approached, her soft scent mixing with the smell of old wood from the attic. Each instrument tells a story, she said. This one holds your mother's stories. Edward watched his daughter hug the violin to her chest, as if she could absorb through contact all the melodies Catherine had played. Something inside him began to unravel, not like destruction, but like ice melting in spring. Can we take him downstairs? Lily asked. I want you to be near the piano. I think, Edward took a deep breath, I think your mother would like that. That night, after Lily went to bed, Edward found Charlotte in the garden. She was sitting on the bench near Catherine's roses, her notebook open on her lap in the soft light of the streetlights. Thank you, he said, sitting down next to her. For today. For everything. Charlotte closed her notebook, turning to him. Lily isn't the only one learning to play a new song, Edward. You are, too. The proximity between them seemed to carry an electricity of its own. Edward could see the small freckles that dotted her nose, the way her eyes reflected the garden lights. I'm afraid, he admitted, his voice just a whisper. To forget. To move on. To… It's not about forgetting, Charlotte interrupted gently. It's about learning to carry memories in a different way. Her fingers brushed accidentally as she moved to stand up, and Edward felt a shiver run down his spine. For a moment they stood still, caught in that moment of unintentional contact. Good evening, Edward, Charlotte said softly, walking away towards the house. Edward remained in the garden, surrounded by the scent of Catherine's roses and the lingering sensation of Charlotte's touch on his fingers. For the first time in years, the silence of the night didn't feel so lonely. The day of the recital dawned peculiarly bright in Greenwich. Edward adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, his fingers trembling slightly as he watched the reflection of Catherine's violin, now positioned on a special stand next to his bed. A subtle but significant change to his daily routine. The last few weeks had transformed the mansion. The sound of the piano filled the halls at different times, and Lily's laughter echoed more frequently. Edward found himself arriving home early from work, sometimes just to sit quietly in the music room, watching his daughter practice under Charlotte's patient guidance. Do you need to get ready for the recital? He asked when he found Charlotte in the kitchen preparing Lily's breakfast. Actually, she replied, turning around with a cup of coffee in her hands. I'm ready. Edward watched her then, really watched her. She wore a simple but elegant navy blue dress, her hair down in soft waves framing her face. It was the first time I had seen her like this, so different from her usual professional or casual appearance. Are you… he began, but was interrupted by the arrival of Lily, already dressed for her performance in a white dress that Mrs. Miller had chosen especially for the occasion. How am I, Dad? Lily asked, turning gently. Perfect, he replied, his voice cracking with suppressed emotion. Just like your mother. Charlotte smiled, discreetly wiping a tear from the corner of her eye as she served breakfast. The intimacy of that family moment made something tighten in Edward's chest, a feeling that became more and more frequent in his presence. In the school auditorium, Edward sat in the front row, Charlotte at his side. The program indicated that Lily would be the 5th performance. As they waited, he noticed how close their hands were on the arm of the chair, almost touching. Is she nervous? He whispered. Less than you, Charlotte replied with a gentle smile. She's been practicing a lot. Trust her. When Lily was announced, a respectful silence filled the auditorium. Mrs. Miller, sitting on Edward's other side, squeezed his hand briefly in support. Lily's small figure appeared on stage, guided by her music teacher. This performance, Lily spoke into the microphone, her voice clear and steady, is dedicated to my mother, Catherine, who also loved music, and to my father, who is learning to listen again. Edward felt the air leave his lungs. Beside him, Charlotte moved her hand discreetly until it touched his, a gesture of comfort that sent waves of heat up his arm. The first notes of Claire de Lune filled the auditorium. Lily played with a sensitivity that transcended her years, her fingers dancing over the keys as if they could see through the touch. Edward closed his eyes, letting himself be transported by the melody that Catherine loved so much. Memories flooded his mind. Catherine playing the violin to that same song, her eyes closed in concentration, the moment they discovered the pregnancy, her last smile before entering the operating room. But this time, the memories didn't just bring pain. There was something more, a kind of peace that was beginning to take hold. As the last note dissipated into the air, the silence was broken by enthusiastic applause. Edward opened his eyes to see his daughter smiling in the approximate direction of where he sat, her eyes shining with tears of joy. Beside him, Charlotte applauded vigorously, her own face marked by trails of tears. The moment Lily left the stage, Edward automatically stood up to go to her, but Charlotte gently stopped him. "Wait," she whispered. "Let her have this moment with her colleagues first. She needs it." He nodded, realizing that Charlotte understood his daughter in ways he was still learning. She watched as other children approached Lily backstage, offering congratulations, which she met with a beaming smile. After the recital, as they waited in the lobby, Grace, Lily's new friend, approached her parents. "Lily plays so well," the girl exclaimed. "Can we schedule a day for her to come and play at the house?" Edward felt the weight of Charlotte's gaze on him. It was the first time Lily had received an invitation like this. "Of course," he replied, surprising himself with the naturalness of the answer. "We can arrange." On the way home, Lily slept in the back seat, exhausted but happy. Charlotte sat next to Edward as he drove, a comfortable silence filling the car. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice low so as not to wake Lily, "for helping her find her own music." Charlotte turned to him, her eyes reflecting the city lights. "She's always had the music inside her, Edward, just like you. Sometimes we just need someone to help us remember how to play." At that moment, stopped at a red light, Edward realized that something fundamental had changed. It wasn't just Lily who was learning to open up to the world. He was also, note by note, discovering a new melody for his life. And maybe, just maybe, Charlotte was more than just the composer of this transformation. She was becoming part of the music itself. The success of the recital brought subtle but significant changes to the Harrison Mansion's routine. Edward began rearranging his meetings to be home on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons when Lily had her piano lessons. Catherine's violin, now positioned on a special stand in the music room, served as a silent bridge between past and present. One particularly hot June afternoon, Edward returned from the office early to find the house eerily quiet. Following the distant sound of laughter, he discovered Charlotte and Lily in the back garden, both sitting on a picnic blanket, surrounded by books and what appeared to be a tactile art project. "It's a surprise for Father's Day," Lily quickly explained when she noticed his presence, trying to hide something behind her back. "You shouldn't be here yet." Edward noticed the blush on Charlotte's cheeks as she helped Lily put away her materials. There was ink on her hands and a blue stain on her cheek that she didn't seem to notice. For some reason, that little detail made his heart race. "Can I join you?" he asked, loosening his tie. "I promised not to spy on the surprise." The smile that lit up Lily's face was answer enough. Charlotte moved to make room for him on the towel, and the movement caused their arms to brush lightly. Edward felt that familiar electric current run through his skin. "We were talking about summer camp," Charlotte mentioned, trying to distract attention from the hidden project. "There is a special program for visually impaired children at Lake George. Lily has expressed interest." Edward felt the familiar weight of anxiety tighten in his chest. Camp? But she was never far from home. "Dad," Lily interjected, her voice carrying a surprising maturity. "Charlotte says sometimes we need to be brave to grow up, like when I played at the recital." The comment hit Edward like a revelation. Her daughter was growing up, developing her own voice, her own aspirations, and much of that was due to the woman sitting next to them, who had entered their lives like a gentle breeze and was gradually transforming into a wind of change. "You're right," he replied, surprising them both. We can at least consider the idea." Charlotte smiled, that smile that seemed to light up her entire face, and Edward realized he was starting to depend on that light more than he cared to admit. "Actually," she began hesitantly, "I was thinking about accompanying you. The camp accepts helpers, so you could have peace of mind." The suggestion made something awaken in Edward's chest, gratitude, relief, and another feeling he wasn't yet ready to name. "Would you do that?" "Charlotte is really going?" Lily asked excitedly, her hands searching for the teachers. "Only if your father agrees," Charlotte replied softly, her eyes meeting Edward's with an intensity that made him catch his breath. At that moment, Mrs. Miller appeared in the garden, announcing that dinner was served. Edward stood up first, reaching out to help Charlotte. When their fingers intertwined, time seemed to slow down. For a moment, they stayed like that, connected by more than just physical touch. During dinner, Edward watched how Charlotte helped Lily locate the cutlery, how she laughed at the girls' jokes, how she turned every moment into a learning opportunity without losing her lightness. It was as if she had filled a void in the house that he didn't even know existed. "I've decided," he announced after Lily had been put to bed. Charlotte was organizing sheet music in the music room when he entered. "About the camp." She turned, the light from the lamp creating soft shadows on her face. "And?" "I think it would be good for her. For all of us." Charlotte nodded, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You're different, Edward. More open to possibilities." "Maybe I have a good teacher," he replied, surprising himself with his playful tone. The comment made Charlotte blush slightly, and she turned her attention to the sheet music. Edward noticed that his hands were shaking slightly. "About this afternoon," she began. "I'm sorry I didn't consult you first about the camp. Sometimes I forget the limits of my role here." Edward took a step towards him, driven by an impulse he couldn't explain. "Your role, Charlotte. You are much more than just—" The sound of her phone interrupted the moment. It was his sister, calling about a family emergency. Edward watched as her face changed expression, concern taking over her features. "I have to go," she said after hanging up. "My niece is in the hospital. Nothing serious, but—" "Of course," Edward replied quickly. "Do you want me to ask Thomas to take you?" "No, I already called an Uber." She hurriedly began to collect her things. "We'll talk more about camp tomorrow." Edward nodded, feeling an inexplicable emptiness as he watched her leave. He stayed in the music room for a long time after she left, his fingers absently tracing the keys of the piano where, hours before, Charlotte had sat with Lily. The mansion felt different now, more alive, more welcoming. And as he watched the night through the window, Edward realized that it wasn't just the house that was changing. He was also, note by note, chord by chord, learning a new melody, one that, surprisingly, had Charlotte's smile as its chorus. The news of Charlotte's niece's hospitalization resolved itself quickly, just a routine appendicitis. But that night's absence left Edward uneasy. Sitting in his office, he found himself checking his watch repeatedly, waiting for the time she normally arrived in the morning. When Charlotte finally appeared, there was something different about her presence. Maybe it was the way her hair was tied up in a casual ponytail, or the way her floral summer dress contrasted with her usual choice of more formal clothing. Edward found himself noticing details that had previously gone unnoticed. "Lily is excited about camp," she commented over breakfast, pouring him a cup of coffee. "Spent all morning asking me about activities." "Have you worked there before?" Edward asked, trying to keep his tone casual as he watched her movements around the kitchen. "Actually, yes. For 2 summers during college." Charlotte sat at the table, closer to him than usual. "It was there that I discovered my calling to work with visually impaired children." The soft scent of her perfume, a mixture of vanilla and something floral that he couldn't identify, reached him, awakening sensations that Edward had been trying to ignore for the last few weeks. "Ms. Miller mentioned that you've had other job offers recently," he said, surprised by the defensive tone in his own voice. Charlotte stopped with the cup halfway to her lips, her eyes meeting his with a disconcerting intensity. "Yes, I did. But I don't intend to accept any of them." "Why not?" "You know why, Edward." The sound of his name in her voice sent a shiver down his spine. Before she could respond, Lily entered the kitchen, her steps more confident than ever. "Charlotte, can we continue our Father's Day surprise today?" the girl asked, finding her way to the chair with ease. "Of course, sweetie. But first, how about we show your dad what you learned yesterday?" Edward watched in fascination as Lily navigated the kitchen with newfound independence, locating ingredients and utensils through an organization system that Charlotte had discreetly implemented over the past few weeks. "I'm making toast by myself now," Lily announced proudly, her little hands moving with surprising assurance. Edward felt his throat tighten with emotion. How many of his daughter's other achievements had he missed because he was so absorbed in his own grief? Charlotte's gentle gaze met his, as if she could read his thoughts. "You're doing an amazing job with her," he said later when he found Charlotte organizing some books in the library. "More than any other professional I've hired." "It's not work for me, Edward." Charlotte turned to him, a book still in her hands. "Lily is special. This house, you—" The air between them seemed to charge with electricity. Edward took a step towards him, driven by an impulse he could no longer control. Charlotte didn't back away, her eyes fixed on his with a mixture of expectation and apprehension. "What are we?" he asked, his voice low and husky. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made them quickly move away. Mrs. Miller appeared in the doorway, apparently oblivious to the moment she had interrupted. "Mr. Harrison, Lily's school is on the line. Something about camp forms." Edward nodded, taking one last look at Charlotte before leaving. She remained in the library, her hands still clinging to the book as if it were an anchor. That night, after putting Lily to bed, Edward found an envelope on his office desk. Inside was a drawing made by her daughter, abstract relief shapes that, according to Charlotte's note, represented her sensations when playing the piano. "She wanted you to understand how she sees music," the note read in Charlotte's delicate handwriting. "Just as Catherine saw it." Edward traced the lines of the drawing with his fingers, feeling every texture, every emotion that his daughter had tried to convey. The tears that came weren't just of sadness. There was something more, something new growing in her heart. He picked up his phone and, before he could think too much, typed a message to Charlotte. "Thank you for helping my daughter find her voice, and for helping me find mine." The answer came minutes later. "Sometimes we need to allow ourselves to hear new melodies, only to discover that the music never really stopped." Edward reread the message several times, feeling the weight of those words. Charlotte had become more than an employee, more than a teacher to Lily. She was the bridge between his past and his future, between pain and the possibility of healing. And as the night wore on in Greenwich, Edward realized he was ready to admit something he had been denying for weeks. He was falling in love with Charlotte. The realization didn't bring the weight of guilt he expected, but rather a feeling of release, as if Catherine was somehow blessing this new chapter in his life. News of the summer camp spread quickly throughout the Harrison mansion. Mrs. Miller threw himself into organizing Lily's trousseau with an almost maternal enthusiasm, while Edward found himself torn between the anxiety of the impending separation and the growing awareness of his feelings for Charlotte. One afternoon, while reviewing camp applications in his office, Edward was surprised by a call from Grace, Lily's friend from school. "Mr. Harrison, my mom wants to know if Lily can come to my sleepover this weekend. Other girls in the class will be coming too." The question caught him off guard. A sleepover meant an entire night away from home, a test for both Lily and him before camp. "I can accompany you," Charlotte offered when he mentioned the invitation during lunch. "I'll stay close by if she needs anything." Edward watched as she methodically cut the food on Lily's plate, a gesture so natural it seemed like it had been a part of their lives forever. "Wouldn't that be too much to ask? It's a Saturday night." "I have no other plans," she replied with a soft smile that made his heart skip a beat. "Plus, it will be good for Lily to socialize more before camp." The decision was met with delight by Lily, who spent the next few days excitedly planning what she would take. Edward watched her with a mixture of pride and melancholy, noticing how his little girl was growing. On Saturday night, while helping Lily pack her bag, Edward found an old photo lying behind the dresser of him and Catherine in the hospital, moments before giving birth. His hands shook as he held the image. "I found this last week." Charlotte's voice surprised him from the doorway. "I thought it best to leave it where it was until you were ready." Edward turned to face her, still holding the photo. "How do you always know?" "Know what?" "The right time for everything." He took a step towards her. "For Lily, for the changes, for—" The sound of Mrs. Miller's footsteps in the hallway interrupted them. Charlotte blushed slightly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "We should go. Grace is waiting." The ride to the Morgan house was silent, filled only by Lily's lively conversation in the back seat. Edward drove, constantly casting glances at Charlotte through the rearview mirror. "I'll call if there's anything," Charlotte promised when they arrived. "But I'm sure she'll be fine." Edward watched as his daughter was greeted warmly by Grace and her friends, feeling a lump in his throat as he watched her walk away with so much confidence. "Do you want me to come back for you later?" Charlotte hesitated for a moment. "Actually, I thought about ordering an Uber. You don't have to worry." "Charlotte." His name came out like a soft plea. "Please let me come." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a silent understanding, a mutual recognition that the professional lines between them were increasingly blurred. Back at the mansion, Edward found himself uneasy. The house felt strangely empty without Lily, and his thoughts kept returning to Charlotte, imagining her with the girls, probably turning every moment into an opportunity for learning and fun. Near midnight, his phone buzzed with a message from her. "Lily fell asleep. Everything is fine. Do you want me to send a photo?" The image that arrived next showed his daughter sleeping peacefully, a soft smile on her lips. Edward felt his heart tighten with love and gratitude. "I'm going out to get you," he replied, already grabbing his keys. The night was surprisingly mild for June in Connecticut. Charlotte was waiting for him on the Morgan's porch, the soft light from the streetlights creating a golden halo around her loose hair. "You didn't need to come so early," she said when he parked. "Lily is sleeping soundly." "I didn't just come for Lily," Edward admitted, his voice low but firm. Charlotte caught her breath, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made the air between them feel electrified. "Edward, I know this is complicated," he continued, taking a step toward you. "You work for me, there's Lily to consider, and Catherine." "Catherine will always be a part of you," Charlotte added softly. "And that's how it should be." "But you," Edward took a deep breath, "you brought music back into our lives, not just for Lily, but for me too." The silence that followed was filled with the distant sound of crickets and the soft beating of their hearts. Charlotte took a small step towards him, closing the space between them even further. "I'm afraid," she confessed in a whisper. "Afraid that this will complicate everything we've built with Lily." "Me too," Edward admitted. but for the first time in 7 years. I'm more afraid of not trying than of trying. His fingers found hers in the dark, a touch soft but full of promise. Charlotte intertwined her fingers with his, and in that simple gesture, there was an entire symphony of possibilities. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the door opening, Grace's mother checking to make sure everything was okay. Charlotte quickly let go of his hand, but the warmth of the touch remained, like a melody that continues to echo even after the music stops. "Should I wake Lily?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Edward nodded, watching her disappear into the house. He stood there under the starry Connecticut sky, feeling as if something fundamental had changed. Not a sudden change, but a gradual realization that his heart still knew how to dance. The morning after Lily spent the night at Grace's house, Edward woke up with a different feeling, as if the air in the Harrison mansion had changed subtly during the night. The events of the previous night on the Morgans' porch remained vivid in his memory. The soft touch of Charlotte's hands, the electricity in the air between them, the unspoken words that seemed to hover like unplayed musical notes. The sound of feminine laughter echoed down the hall. Lily had returned earlier with Charlotte, and they both seemed engrossed in some activity in the music room. Edward adjusted his tie, a morning ritual that now seemed strangely formal, and followed the sound. "And then Grace taught me how to braid bracelets," Lily explained excitedly, her small hands moving deftly over colorful strings. "Charlotte said I can identify the colors by the different texture of each thread." Edward stood in the doorway, watching as Charlotte sat on the floor with her daughter, gently guiding her fingers between the laces. She looked up upon noticing his presence, and a soft blush stained her cheeks. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of shyness that hadn't been there before. "Dad!" Lily exclaimed. "You need to feel this. Charlotte put different embossments in each color so I could do it myself." Edward came over, sitting on the rug with them. His knees lightly brushed Charlotte's, and he felt that familiar electric current run through his body. "Show me," he asked, holding out his hand. Lily placed the strings in her hands, enthusiastically explaining how each texture corresponded to a different color. Edward watched in wonder as his daughter had blossomed under Charlotte's care, transforming from a shy, withdrawn girl into a confident, expressive child. "The sleepover was a success," Charlotte commented as Lily continued her work. "Grace has a wonderful family. They treated her as if it were perfectly natural to have a blind friend, without overprotection or condescension." "Like you," Edward replied, his eyes meeting hers. "You never treated her like someone who needed fixing." The moment was interrupted by Mrs. Miller announcing that breakfast was served. In the kitchen, Edward noticed how the dynamic between them had subtly changed. Every movement seemed loaded with meaning. Every look exchanged told an unspoken story. "I have an important meeting today," he mentioned as they drank coffee, "on the company's expansion to the West Coast." "Oh," Charlotte replied, a shadow of disappointment crossing her face. "So you won't be home for piano lesson?" "Actually," he cleared his throat, adjusting his tie again, "I thought I'd reschedule the meeting. I'd like to see how you two work together." The smile that lit up Lily's face was matched only by the sparkle in Charlotte's eyes. Mrs. Miller, arranging the dishes, cast a knowing glance between the two adults. During piano lesson that afternoon, Edward watched from his seat as Charlotte turned each note into a tactile experience for Lily. His hands danced over his daughter's, guiding her through the melody with a patience and dedication that made her heart clench. "Music isn't just about listening," Charlotte explained. "It's about feeling. Every note has its own vibration, its own story to tell." Edward realized he was learning just as much as Lily, not just about music, but about how love could manifest itself in different ways, through patience, dedication, small gestures that built bridges over abysses that seemed insurmountable. When Lily went to do her homework, Edward found Charlotte organizing the sheet music. "About last night," he began, his voice low but firm. "Edward," she interrupted softly, turning to face him, "I need you to be sure. Not just for me, but for Lily. She's been through so much. I've been thinking a lot, he replied, taking a step towards her. About Catherine, about the past, about how you brought light back to this house. It's not just gratitude I feel, Charlotte. And it's not just a job for me, she admitted, her eyes shining with suppressed emotion. You two have become so much more. The sound of the piano interrupted the moment. Lily had quietly returned and started practicing. The melody flowed softly through the air, filling the space between them with notes of possibility and promise. Dinner with me? Edward asked impulsively. Tomorrow night, Mrs. Miller can stay with Lily. Charlotte hesitated for a moment, her fingers playing nervously with the edge of a sheet of music. That would change everything. Maybe, he agreed, but some changes are worth the risk. Before she could respond, Lily called for help with a particularly difficult passage in the song. Charlotte cast one last glance at Edward before joining the girl at the piano, but her soft smile carried an answer that words couldn't express. As he watched them work together, Edward felt as if he was watching the birth of something new and precious, a symphony that began softly but promised to grow in complexity and beauty. And for the first time in a long time, he was eager to hear the next notes. Morning broke over Greenwich with palpable anticipation in the air. Edward adjusted his bow tie for the third time in front of the mirror, a gesture that reflected more his anticipation about dinner with Charlotte than actual concern about his appearance. A reservation at Le Bernardin in Manhattan awaited, a restaurant he hadn't visited since his days with Catherine. "Dad, are you nervous?" Lily's voice surprised him from the bedroom door. She was sitting in her special wheelchair, a recent gift from Charlotte that allowed her greater independence in her movements around the house. "How do you know?" he asked, turning to his daughter with a smile that she could hear in his voice. "You tap your foot when you're nervous. Charlotte taught me how to perceive sound patterns in people. It's like a song that everyone carries." The mention of her name made his heart skip a beat. Edward approached Lily, kneeling so he was eye level. "What do you think of Charlotte, dear?" Lily tilted her head thoughtfully. "She makes you smile. I can hear it in her voice when she's around. It gets lighter, like the high notes on the piano." His daughter's insight caught him off guard. Before he could respond, Mrs. Miller appeared in the hallway. "Mr. Harrison, Miss Reynolds called. She will meet you directly at the restaurant. She had to take care of something at Lily's school first." The drive to Manhattan was filled with thoughts about how her life had changed in the last few months. The mansion, once a mausoleum of painful memories, now vibrated with music and laughter. Lily was blooming, and his own heart, which he thought was permanently frozen, was beginning to melt under the gentle warmth of Charlotte's presence. Le Bernardin glowed with its characteristic elegance when Edward arrived. Charlotte was already waiting for him at the bar, wearing a midnight blue dress that made her eyes look even deeper. Seeing her, Edward felt that familiar rush of heat that her presence always caused. "Sorry I'm late," she said as he approached. "Lily's teacher wanted to discuss some accommodations for next semester." "Always thinking of her first," Edward smiled, noticing how Charlotte blushed under his appreciative gaze. The maitre d' led them to their table, a discreet location overlooking the restaurant's internal garden. Edward found his hands shaking slightly as he pulled out the chair for Charlotte. "This is weird," she admitted after they placed their orders. "Being here, like this, as something more than Lily's teacher." "And what exactly are you, Charlotte?" Edward asked softly, his eyes meeting hers in the soft candlelight. "Someone who cares deeply about you and your daughter," she answered honestly. "Someone who is afraid of complicating something precious that we have built." The sommelier interrupted briefly to pour the wine, giving Edward a moment to collect his thoughts. When they were alone again, he reached his hand across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "Catherine taught me that love isn't something that diminishes when shared," he said, his voice low but firm. "In fact, it grows. It transforms. What I feel for you doesn't diminish what I felt, what I still feel, for her." Charlotte intertwined her fingers with his, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "And Lily?" "Lily was the one who showed me that I can still love." Edward smiled. "She sees, or rather feels, things that took me years to realize." Dinner flowed like a well-played melody, each moment building on the last. They talked about music, about Lily's progress, about their own fears and hopes. It was as if they were discovering each other again, no longer restricted by the roles they occupied. "There's something I need to show you," Edward said when they finished their dessert. "A special place." The short drive to Central Park was made in comfortable silence, your hands occasionally touching on the car seat. Edward led her to Bethesda Terrace, where the fountain sparkled under the night lights. "Catherine and I met here," he explained, stopping near the fountain. "She was playing the violin for passers-by, trying to raise money for her classes at the conservatory." Charlotte squeezed his hand gently, understanding the meaning of the moment. "For a long time I avoided this place," Edward continued. "But now I want to share it with you. Because you taught me that it is possible to honor the past while embracing the future." Turning to face her, Edward felt his heart quicken. Charlotte looked beautiful in the soft light of the park's lanterns, her eyes reflecting the dancing waters of the fountain. "Charlotte," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "You brought music back into our lives when we thought silence was all we had left. And I'm in love with you." The world seemed to stop for a moment, suspended between one note and another. Then Charlotte smiled, that smile that lit up her entire face, and approached him. "I love you too," she whispered, her words carrying the certainty of a truth long known. When their lips met, it was as if a new symphony began to play, not erasing the previous melody, but harmonizing with it, creating something entirely new and equally beautiful. Returning to the Harrison mansion that night carried a different atmosphere. Edward and Charlotte remained silent during the drive from Manhattan to Greenwich, their fingers intertwined on the car's center console, as if they feared the moment might dissipate if they let go. Mrs. Miller was waiting for them at the entrance, her normally stern face softened by an understanding smile. "Lily just fell asleep," she reported. "He spent all night working on a new composition that he wants to show you tomorrow." "How was she?" Charlotte asked, the professional concern still present in her voice even after the night's events. "Excited. Said she could feel something important was going to happen today." The housekeeper cast a meaningful glance at their still clasped hands before discreetly retreating. Edward guided Charlotte to the music room, the place that had become the beating heart of the house over the past few months. Moonlight streamed in through the French windows, creating dancing shadows over Catherine's piano and violin, now in their place of honor. "We should talk about how to tell her," Charlotte said softly, her fingers tracing the piano keys without pressing down. "Lily is sensitive to change, and I don't want her to feel insecure," Edward added, approaching her from behind. "You always think of her first." "She's my priority." Charlotte turned to face him. "It always will be. What we have, it can't interfere with her progress." Edward touched her face gently, marveling at how this simple gesture now felt so natural. "That's why I fell in love with you. Your heart is big enough to love Lily as your own daughter, while respecting Catherine's memory." Charlotte closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "I'm scared," she admitted, "of not being enough, of not being able to balance it all." "You already are," he whispered, bringing his lips to hers. "More than enough." The kiss was interrupted by a sound coming from the hallway. Lily, in her wheelchair, had woken up and was looking for them. "Dad, Charlotte," I heard voices. They parted quickly, but not with guilt. Edward looked at Charlotte before replying, "We're in the music room, honey. Want to join us?" Lily maneuvered her chair with the dexterity Charlotte had taught her. Her moonlit face seemed more mature somehow, as if she too was on the verge of a major transformation. "How was dinner?" she asked, a knowing smile on her lips. Your voices are different, more musical." Charlotte laughed softly, moving closer to adjust the blanket over Lily's knees. "As observant as ever. In fact, we wanted to talk to you about something important." "You're in love," Lily stated simply. "I already knew. The tune between you changed weeks ago." Edward and Charlotte exchanged surprised looks. "How did you—" Edward began. "Charlotte taught me that love has its own sound," Lily explained, reaching out her hands to meet theirs. "Like when Mom played the violin on the recordings you showed me. There was something special about the way she played for you, Dad. And now, when Charlotte is around, her voice has that same quality." Tears glistened in Charlotte's eyes as she knelt beside Lily's chair. "You're a very special girl, you know that, and nothing will change how much I care about you." "I know," Lily smiled, "but now you can take care of Daddy too. He needed someone to teach his heart to play music again." Edward felt his heart swell with love for his daughter, so young and yet so wise. "Are you really okay with this, honey?" "As long as Charlotte still teaches me piano," Lily joked, eliciting laughter from the adults. "And maybe she can stay here permanently? Like family?" The innocent request made Charlotte catch her breath. Edward came closer, wrapping both of them in his arms, his daughter and the woman who had brought color back to their monochromatic world. "Let's go slowly," Charlotte whispered, but her smile betrayed the happiness in her heart. "One chord at a time." "Like a symphony," Lily agreed sleepily. "Starting soft and growing little by little." Edward realized that this was exactly how his love for Charlotte had developed, like a delicate melody that gained strength and complexity until it became impossible to ignore. And now, with Lily blessing this new harmony in their lives, the future seemed full of musical possibilities. "Time to go back to bed," Charlotte announced gently, noticing Lily's heavy eyes. "Tomorrow you can show us your new composition." As they guided Lily back to her room, Edward felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. The photographs of Catherine in the hallways seemed to smile in approval, as if she too understood that love, like music, need not be limited to a single melody to be true and profound. The July sun made Catherine's roses shine with a particular splendor that morning. Edward watched through his office window as Charlotte and Lily worked in the garden, preparing a small sensory garden, yet another of the innovative projects that had transformed every corner of the mansion into a learning opportunity. "Herbs have different scents," Lily's excited voice carried to him. "The rosemary is stronger, and the mint makes my fingers tingle." The domestic scene made his heart clench in a now familiar way, no longer with pain, but with a mixture of gratitude and love that still surprised him. In the 3 weeks since that night in Central Park, their lives had become even more deeply intertwined, like notes in a complex composition. The phone on his desk rang, bringing news he was eagerly awaiting. The date for summer camp had been confirmed, and with it, an important decision needed to be made. "Mr. Harrison," Mrs. Miller knocked softly on the door. "The papers you requested arrived from the lawyer." Edward took the envelope with slightly shaking hands. Inside was the documentation needed to make official something her heart already knew to be true. The change in Charlotte's status from employee to something much more significant. "Father," Lily called from the garden, "come and feel what we planted." Descending the stairs with the documents in his pocket, Edward found his little makeshift family sitting among the freshly prepared flower beds. Charlotte had dirt on her cheeks and a radiant smile that made her eyes shine. "Close your eyes," Lily instructed as he approached. "That's how I experience things. Charlotte says sometimes we need to turn off one sense to truly appreciate the others." Edward obeyed, letting his daughter guide his hands between the different plants. Each touch brought a new sensation, a new aroma. He felt Charlotte's fingers brush against his occasionally, sending that familiar electric current through his body. "Camp called," he mentioned when they finished their sensory exploration. "It will start in 2 weeks. Lily clapped her hands excitedly, but Charlotte stayed quiet, a shadow of worry crossing her face. "We need to start preparations then," she said, her professional voice masking something else. "Actually," Edward cleared his throat, feeling the weight of the documents in his pocket, "there is something I would like to discuss with you two." Mrs. Miller appeared at the garden door at that moment, as if she knew just when her presence would be needed. "How about a special tea for this conversation?" she suggested, her tone revealing that perhaps she wasn't the only one who knew what was coming. In the music room, the place that had become the emotional heart of the house, Edward watched as Charlotte helped Lily into her favorite armchair. Catherine's violin seemed to shine in the afternoon light, a silent witness to the moment. "Charlotte," he began, his voice firmer than he felt, "these last few weeks have made me realize something that deep down, I think I've always known since you came into our lives." She stopped arranging the cushions, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "You turned this house back into a home," he continued, "not just as a teacher or a carer, but as someone who completely understands what Lily and I need, sometimes before we even know it." "Edward," Charlotte whispered, but he gently raised his hand, asking to continue. "Camp will be an important experience for Lily, but I don't want you to just go as her date." He took the documents out of his pocket. "I want you to go as an official part of this family." Lily tilted her head, a knowing smile on her lips. "Are you going to ask Charlotte to marry you, Dad?" The blush on Charlotte's cheeks deepened, but she didn't look away. Edward walked over, taking her hands in his. "It's not a marriage proposal. Yet," he smiled. "It's a request for you to officially move here, not as an employee, but as my partner, as someone Lily already considers a second mother." I don't know what to say," Charlotte stammered, tears glistening in her eyes. "Say yes," Lily exclaimed, her voice brimming with joy. "So we can make music together every day." Charlotte laughed through her tears, squeezing Edward's hands. "Are you sure? It's a big step." "As sure as Catherine was when she told me that music can heal any broken heart," he replied softly. "You proved her right." Mrs. Miller discreetly left the tea tray and withdrew, but not before Edward noticed the satisfied smile on her face. Years of service to the Harrison family had made her an expert at reading the signs of healing and renewal. "Yes," Charlotte finally replied, her voice steady despite her tears. "Yes to everything." Lily cheered, and Edward pulled them both into a tight hug. Catherine's violin seemed to resonate silently, as if approving the new harmony that was being formed. "Now I can play my new composition," Lily declared, moving to the piano. "I wrote it with the three of us in mind." As the first notes filled the room, Edward held Charlotte closer, both of them listening to the music his daughter had created. A piece that spoke of loss and new beginnings, of love old and new, of a family that had learned that the heart, like an orchestra, has room for many different melodies. Preparations for summer camp have turned the Harrison mansion into a whirlwind of activity. Edward watched, with a mixture of anxiety and pride, as Charlotte and Lily methodically organized their suitcases, each item carefully labeled in Braille. Charlotte's official move into the house had happened gradually over the past few weeks, her belongings naturally finding their places among the existing memories. "I found this in the attic," Charlotte said one morning, holding a dusty box of old sheet music. "They're Catherine's original compositions. I thought Lily might want to adapt them for piano." Edward felt his heart skip a beat as he recognized his late wife's handwriting on the yellowed pages. "She never got to present them publicly," he explained, his voice soft with memory. "I said they were very personal." "Like love letters in song form," Lily commented from her place at the piano, her fingers gliding gently over the keys. "Can we play them at the camp's closing recital?" The suggestion took Edward by surprise. The closing recital would be a significant event, the first time Lily would perform in front of a larger audience since her school debut. Charlotte had mentioned that other parents would be staying near the camp during the final week to participate in the final activities. "I think your mother would love that," Charlotte replied before Edward could find the words. especially if we can get hold of the piano and violin compositions. Do you play the violin? Edward asked, surprised by this new revelation. Charlotte blushed slightly. I studied for a few years at the conservatory. I'm nowhere near as talented as Catherine was, but— Please, Lily interrupted, her face lighting up with excitement. We can do a duet. Me on the piano, Charlotte on Mom's violin. Edward watched the exchange of glances between his daughter and Charlotte, a moment of silent understanding that made his heart swell with love for both of them. Catherine always said that instruments hold memories of the hands that played them, he commented, approaching the violin on its stand. Maybe it's time to create some new ones. In the weeks that followed, the mansion was filled with the sounds of constant practice. Charlotte devoted her afternoons to working with Lily on adapting Catherine's compositions, transforming written notes into a language her daughter could understand through touch. At night, after Lily was asleep, Edward would find her in the music room, practicing alone with the violin, her movements becoming more and more confident. I'm afraid I won't do her songwriting justice, Charlotte confessed one night as they shared a quiet moment in the garden. Somehow I feel like I'm asking Catherine for permission every time I play. Edward took her hand, intertwining their fingers. Catherine believed that music was a form of love that transcends time. You are helping our daughter connect with her in a way I have never been able to provide. The day of departure for camp arrived with a mix of emotions. Mrs. Miller filled the car with specially prepared snacks, her efficient hands hiding the excitement in her eyes. Take good care of them, she instructed Edward with her usual practical firmness. The drive to Lake George was filled with lively conversations about planned activities and occasional stops for Lily to explore new textures and sounds. Edward watched in the rearview mirror as Charlotte turned every moment into a learning opportunity, her heart expanding with the realization that this was her family now, not a replacement for what she had lost, but a new harmony built on the foundations of their previous love. The camp, located in a wooded area by the lake, impressed Edward with its adapted structure and specialized staff. As he helped unload the bags, he noticed how other parents and children greeted Charlotte by name. Her reputation in the field of special education clearly preceded her. Let's perform on that stage, Lily excitedly pointed to the open-air amphitheater next to the lake. Charlotte says the acoustics are perfect, and the sound travels over the water like waves. Recital week arrived faster than Edward expected. Sitting in the front row of the amphitheater, he watched the final preparations, his heart pounding in anticipation. Catherine's violin, now in Charlotte's gentle hands, seemed to glow under the stage lights. When Lily took her place at the piano, her posture radiated confidence. Charlotte stood beside him with the violin, and for a moment, Edward could have sworn he saw a reflection of Catherine in the way she held the instrument. The first notes of the composition filled the night air, dancing over the waters of the lake. It was a melody that spoke of love and loss, of new beginnings and old memories, of hearts that learned to grow even through pain. Lily played with a sensitivity that transcended her years, her small hands moving over the keys as if they could see through the touch. Charlotte complemented each note with the violin, creating a harmony that seemed to unite past and present in a single song. Edward closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. In his mind, he could see Catherine smiling, blessing this new symphony her family had created. As the last note dissipated over the lake, the silence that followed was broken by emotional applause. That night, as the stars twinkled over Lake George, Edward held Charlotte and Lily in his arms, feeling like he was finally whole again. Not in the same way as before. Some melodies, once finished, cannot be repeated. But a new song had begun, equally beautiful in its own unique composition. Catherine would be proud, Charlotte whispered, her words carrying the weight of a long-understood truth. And Edward knew deep in his heart that she was right. Because love, like music, knows no limits. It only grows, transforms, and finds new ways to touch the hearts it leaves behind.